we had literally a go Yami strategy, right? So we're like Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft. All of the decision making in terms of building everything out was with keeping that into the frame of reference. And so negotiations get a little hairy sometimes. I remember Chad, Chad, our CEO, there might have been some threats of physical violence if somebody at Google didn't do X, Y, or Z.
Scott Bogdan is the co-founder and chief operation officer at CloneForce AI, an agentic AI company building digital teammates to help organizations expand human productivity. Scott brings nearly 3 decades of experience across technology, media, operations, and entrepreneurship. He previously served as a senior vice president of operations at Veritone, helping scale one of the early enterprise AI platforms, and was a founding executive at DMARC Broadcasting, whose studio advertising platform was acquired by Google in a deal valued over $400 million. Today, Scott is helping define the next era of AI, where software evolves from the tool into a true digital teammate that can plan, act, collaborate, and improve alongside human teams. So let's welcome Scott. Well, hi, Scott.
Hi.
Welcome to our show. Thank you for being here with us today.
Of course. So
before we get started, I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
If your life was a movie, what would you title it as?
Okay, that's a tough one. I'm going to go with Tombstone. That movie, it was daily life is a struggle. And I think as an entrepreneur, there are some similarities. I think, hopefully at this point in my life, I get to enjoy a little bit more of it and, grab a vacation here and there with the kids. But I think there are some similarities with the characters in that movie.
Well, you talk about being an entrepreneur.
Okay.
And earlier we talked about you having your first entrepreneurial moment. I think you said it was when you were 10 years old. Is that right?
Yeah. It's right.
Tell us about your first entrepreneurial experience.
Yeah, part of it came from my parents, I think, from my dad in particular. I remember vividly when I was younger, him just kind of always saying you want to gravitate towards working for yourself. That made sense to me at a young age. I started a company. I guess my first company I started was a company called Scott's Home Care Service. And now that I'm 3 kids deep, I, to a certain extent, don't understand why they would trust me. But yeah, I'd watch my neighbors' houses as they were out of town on vacation. And so we had that. We had the proverbial car washing business, a handful of those different types of ventures when I was pretty young.
Can you take me back to your first sale?
First sale, as related to Scott's Home Care Service, was a nice family across the Greenbelt. I had made up flyers. I was passing them around everywhere. I had dropped off one at the neighbor's house across the Greenbelt, and he kind of started, I didn't know what I was doing really, but then he starts grilling me, and I had to put up a defensible position in terms of why they should trust me. I'm like, well, I'm going to be a lot cheaper than anyone else you could think of, because 10-year-old doesn't need too much money. But I do vividly remember I would consider that my first sale for sure.
I have a question.
Sure.
Take me back, because you had mentioned your first company you were like, what, 10 years old?
Yeah, this one, yeah.
What took you to the point where like, hey, I'm going to start my business?
You know what, from there it just started, growing, right? I mean, it was the conventional 9 to 5, although I wasn't adverse to it at all. I wanted, I did understand the concept of equity, I guess, at a somewhat of a young age.
At 10 years old.
Well, not to that extent, but moving forward into college and preparing for what I wanted to major in, I think that idea of owning a majority or a piece of what you're building resonated with me, versus just kind of collecting a paycheck, and I think it all sort of stemmed from there at the end of the day.
And then you talked about what you wanted to study in college. So you studied business in college then?
Yeah, I played football at the Air Force Academy my freshman year. A lot of my friends were having a lot more fun up the road in Boulder. So in Boulder, I wanted to, I love the mountains. I love Colorado. So transferred up there and immediately, got into the Leeds Business School where I majored. It was a kind of dual major between the engineering school and the business school. So it was entrepreneurship with an area of application in systems, information systems.
So what did you end up doing with that degree?
Believe it or not, I'm using my degree. I think I'm one of very few people that use their degree every day, as an ops, CIO or, IT guy, manage all of our corporate systems, tightly coupled with obviously our product sets and building software. As the sort of lead on the customer experience side of things, I take a lot of what I think about from that perspective and try to build that into, whatever software we're launching to our users.
Well, that's where you are now. Let's take us back. So our podcast is your first overnight success.
Right. Okay.
So did you have a first overnight success earlier, like out of college?
Yeah, I think our first business probably, in the conventional overnights, like I know probably everyone says that, but we had sold it to CMGI, I think no more than 11 months after I'd been there. And I was the fourth employee with my buddy at the end of the day. And so, this is late 90s, drove home 1 day after graduation, a couple speeding tickets on the way from Colorado back here, and then was in the office Monday. And then we had sold that to, I think it was 11 months later, I was just getting shipped off to Boston to help close the deal out and finalize
take
that.
Us back to that moment. So you graduate with a degree in entrepreneurship, and then how did you end up forming your first company?
So, it was a somewhat stereotypical VC-funded entity. If you guys remember, that was during the first real significant bubble.
What year was that?
So it was 97 or 97, 98.
So right before the .com.
Yeah, it was right as the bubble was growing and right before it dissipated.
So as a first-time founder, aside from your Scott's home care business,
right,
but your first real business out of college, how did you know that you could start a business? What was the opportunity? Did you have conversations with friends? Did you have a partnership? How did that formation happen?
So two of my best friends growing up had started a company a couple years prior called AdForce. AdForce was one of the first interactive ad delivery platforms that were out there. And then right as I was graduating, Ryan and I kind of spun out a rep group from that. And so, I had been talking with them. Okay, what's the next step? What's going on? Watching very closely, obviously, what was happening on the technology side of things. Then that's when Ryan kind of was like, hey, what do you think? Let's do this. And I'm like, okay, done. At 23 years old, 22 years old, you don't put as much thought into it as you do now. So it was like, okay, great, done. Yeah.
So Scott, you just graduated with entrepreneurship, but you were an entrepreneur starting at a very young age. So tell me about nature versus nurture. All right. What was that real impetus to start that first business after college when you had an education, but you also had some entrepreneurial DNA?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because the more I think about it, there was no other option, meaning...
Could have taken a job?
Yeah, but it was not like at that age, especially. I've thought about that more as I got older, where I'm like, okay, even coming off of our last company, which, I was with for 10 years, longest we had ever all been a part of the same entity. Whereas, saw what was happening in the space, realized that, investing a lot of time and effort up front warranted sometimes astronomical valuations. And so why not go for that? And at 22, there's no risk. You don't have a family yet. It doesn't matter where you live. And the market was open to 22-year-old crazy kids, putting these types of companies together. But the partnership, really was an important part of that in terms of kind of everyone understanding their roles and how you're going to attack and scale something.
So it's the DNA, you and your partners together.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And what came out of that collaboration.
Yeah. And everyone's very like-minded, obviously, in terms of just work ethic and approach and a lot of the innovation that was going into, those type of technologies at the time.
And I have a very curious question.
Okay.
So at 22, you guys came up with an idea and you went to raise VC money. Walk us through the process of that, because today's landscape, it must be very different than the 90s.
Yeah, 100%. And at that point, I wasn't as, we had hired a, big boy CFO, so to speak, that had at least a few years of working experience at that point. So wasn't as involved. But yeah, I think, and that was crazy about that time is, if things had the right fundamentals, I guess the biggest difference between that, and you didn't even need to have the semblance of profitability in your model, right? And so obviously I'm glad we're not doing that anymore, where, now business and mechanics need to be there. Your run rate needs to be where it needs to be. We had a couple of instances where, was product market fit there with some of the other businesses, but that first one in particular, to a certain extent, they were throwing money at people, and it was panning out. But once we did sell that, I went out to Boston to kind of close the deal and worked for CMGI for a year out there. And that's where, they were buying so many companies at the time. But then there wasn't really too much of an integration. And so that was a whole nother side of things, like where I really learned, during that acquisition over times and how to grow your business through acquisition, obviously is a big component to that. And then really making sure, how many pencils are in each drawer and, what those roles are across the entire entity.
When you formed the company you had one partner?
Yeah. Ryan was the CEO, okay, and he was the primary driver. Yeah.
Did you start the company and already have an exit in mind?
For that one, I mean, to a certain extent, we did. Very much so with the company DMARC Broadcasting that we ended up selling to Google. When we had built that out, we had made an early acquisition of kind of the, I think, second place player in terms of digital automation studio systems. So, back then, a lot of radio stations were literally like sticking carts, like 8 tracks and that's how they played all of the music, all the spots. And so this was the beginning of the transfer to digital systems to manage that. And then we just took what we built on the interactive side of things, HTTP ad tags, applied that to audio files. They still call them carts. And then we were able to digitally insert ads in real time into the broadcast radio stream. And so we knew that the big media companies needed to get into traditional media. And so 100%, we down to, what color schemes we use for the software. Like, okay, if we want to sell it to Google or Microsoft or Yahoo, let's make it easy for them and use their stack and use their color schemes, and that paid off to a certain extent. I mean, anytime you're trying to build it into a mature product like AdWords, there's going to be some heavy lifting, but that strategy, I think, paid off just because we, again, like-minded organizations, both Google and our company and AdForce and Toucan kind of grew up at the same time together. We knew a lot of the team members over there. This was prior to the the YouTube acquisition. And so just everybody in the digital space had been kind of working together for a while at that point.
So I heard him say subtly, we sold it to Google. Did I hear correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Can we slow down a little bit and take us to that moment, please? And we want to hear all about that.
Yeah, definitely a highlight. I think, there was a couple times I remember vividly when we did sell our company to CMGI. As an entrepreneur, you're used to that change. I mean, you're kind of ready for that change, but as you build up teams, not everyone's been a part of that. Some people just come to work and they do a great job. And so I remember the HR person coming in from CMGI and kind of saying, what change isn't bad, it's just different. And that quote has stuck with me forever. I really agree and appreciated what she was saying, but you're communicating to a bunch of 22-year-old kids that are like, okay, but yeah. So for the, when we sold the other company to Google, I mean, highlight of our career, obviously, a lot of media behind all of that. But, it was one of those things where, there was, I think it was about $400 million, consideration up front. And then we had a whole host of earnout objectives. And that, I will say to other entrepreneurs, is always tough because once you're in a large environment like that, without the freedom to kind of manage and do whatever you need to, there's certain, roadblocks that go up, and it can't help but feel like, wait, are they are they trying to put a damper on the growth, just to scale back and, all of that frame of reference or, that thinking happens. But yeah, at the end of the day, so excited for the employee base, so excited for our investors. And spent 3 years at Google and really, forged a lot of great relationships and kind of was able to put the finishing touches on sort of the digital media side of my career.
Well, let's take us back. So I know we have a lot of founders that are in our community. They're probably wondering, what is that moment like when you're going to be pitching to Google?
Yeah.
How did you first hear about it? take us back to that moment, and then how did you prepare for it, and then how did it go?
Yeah, I think, like I'm saying, like when we had literally a go Yami strategy, right? So we're like Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft. All of the decision making in terms of building everything out was with keeping that into the frame of reference. And so negotiations get a little hairy sometimes. I remember Chad, Chad, our CEO, there might have been some threats of physical violence if somebody at Google didn't do X, Y, or Z. I do remember that closing dinner was I had one of the best bottles of wine I've ever had in my life. It's weird how certain things kind of stick with you. And we were up in, Bay Area, and I'm, at a nice dinner with a, bigger team. And just that one, for some reason, that bottle of wine, this is going to stick in my memory. But again, you're so happy for all of the other employees and team members, that you just kind of built up, because building a team and building a company at the same time there's a innate challenge in that. And so, getting to, celebrate with, everybody that had been working so hard to make it happen was really special.
And can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
I want to talk about the team, because first thing that what you guys stood out to me is the co-founders. You guys have built every single company together, right? You had started a startup and you guys went through an M&A.
Yep.
And then you just said earlier, the teams.
Yep.
You know what HR said, change it. What did you say? Change is okay.
Change isn't bad. It's just different.
It's just different.
Yeah.
Right. And we know teams are so important in building company, and then you guys are building culture. Can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think, especially on the operations side of things, where there's certainly a certain element of individual contributors that build that up, but in almost every, if it's customer success, if it's customer support, if it's business operations, or even data operations, at the end of the day, I do feel like these are the team members that are really shepherding the growth of the company to a large extent. Can't do it without sales, can't do it without marketing, can't do it without those functions as well. But the relationships that get forged when you're in the foxhole kind of fighting the battles with everybody, I think has a lot, spills over and carries over to a lot. Yeah.
What was the strategy in acquiring talent? Early on, everybody goes to equity because they don't have cash. But if you got cash, should you give equity? At this point, you guys were pretty well healed compared to other startups. What did you do? What did you do for that? And how was that translated into the other startups that came after?
And it's a tough one, especially now. Like, I think market dynamics now are much different, especially with the engineers, and we're staffing up our current company, and need to find some of the world's leading engineers, and they're not cheap. And so balancing that equity with the cash comp, when they can go down the street, and sometimes we're talking double the salary than of what we can afford as an early stage company. So a lot of times, like personally, when I'm building my teams, I'm looking for people that definitely are able to have the same kind of mindset on how we want to kind of build this out, and what does success look like, right? And I think some of that just comes from clarity of communication across the organization, and really making sure everyone's, we used to say at Veritone, this is silly comment, but it resonated with me. We were all on the road to Mammoth. And so if we're all going to Mammoth, we all need to know where we are, why we're going to Mammoth, what we're going to do when it was such a weird statement, but being on the same page with how that growth needs to happen, I think has a lot to do with it.
So when you set up your cap table, did you have an employee pool for this?
Yeah, I think I'm in every company we've had an employee pool, and that's really, and dating back to the late 90s, I mean, not necessarily for our company, but I mean, I remember the janitors, there were janitors at Facebook, I think, that became millionaires. And so, building that, building the equity out, across, with option pools and everything else for the entire employee base has always been central to kind of my belief system when it comes to.
So sharing the wealth has been important to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to give us context about the size of this acquisition, can you share some numbers about the Google acquisition?
Yeah, so it was I think 1.2 billion was the overarching. Then there was 400 million upfront, and then there was or 300 million upfront, and then a whole host of additional milestones that we needed to hit, and we hit a couple of them. And I think so total consideration was right around 400 million or so.
Okay, so it was a $1.2 billion deal.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So when you have a deal like that, how do you end up maintaining? You talk about building the team, having that call. How do you end up maintaining it during that scaling period?
Yeah, I think, I mean, now we're getting into some of the specifics around Google, which, you could fill up 50 podcasts with just that. We were at that time where there was hypergrowth at Google. I remember, it wasn't even that long after I'd been there, maybe 8 months after I'd been there.
Can you paint a picture of what year that was in?
That was, what was that, 2006? Don't quote me on that, but right around there.
About 2000.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Where were we right before that?
You're saying that Google was going through hypergrowth.
Yeah, hypergrowth. So I hadn't even been there that long, and somebody, circulated around this chart that showed me that even though I had only been there for 9 months, I had been there longer than like 98% of all other employees at Google. And I'm like, oh my God, that's serious growth. Like after 9 months, the amount of people they added to their team, put me in the top 5 percentage points of length of time that I had been there. And I remember thinking at that time, and I loved my time there, loved the folks there, but just not necessarily my cup of tea in that I saw certain things where there's so much growth, you're trying to get as much engineering talent on staff as possible to the certain, and then, they're amazing managers, don't get me wrong, but you're just growing that fast. You can't always get product out the door. You can't always react to the market as fast as you want to. And I remember thinking, I feel like we're almost stifling innovation, not helping innovation just in the broader sense of the words, because we're tripping over ourselves because we're growing so fast. It takes such a concerted effort to keep everybody organized and on track. Yeah.
But for clarity, it wasn't, if I'm hearing you correctly, it wasn't how Google was operating. It was simply the fact you were in a mega company that's skyrocketing.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the business was doing extremely well. The growth mechanics and I think they, at the end of the day, did a masterful job of managing their growth curve. But, as you're going through it, it's a lot to contend with for, the entire employee base.
So when you're talking about the hyper growth and you mentioned tripping over each other, can you explain what that looks like?
Sure. I think, trying, because at that point, I mean, it's still an entrepreneurial company for sure. I mean, every public company we've either taken public or I've worked for, we still run it like a startup at the end of the day. Even, Veritone, which was at 12 years old at this point, until my departure, we ran it every day like a startup, because quite frankly, the executive teams didn't know any different. I think. I mean, that probably is changing a little bit over time, but in terms of the managing the growth cycles, I think communication has a lot to do with it, and just making sure roles, responsibilities. I mean, if it's at the very beginning of building out a company, I mean, one of the things I do just as an exercise is, I'll try to map out the organization for the next multiple years, and sometimes we don't even know the market dynamics at this point. But for people that are coming into the new team members that are coming in, I want them to know where everything's supposed to happen. And, even like right now is a perfect example where we only have 5 or 6 people on my team. There's no one in biz ops. There, we obviously use clones or clone labor, for a host of what we do. But I also want people to understand fully baked and where would we be once we kind of hit our those growth paths. And I think that has a lot to do with just business execution is really what that communication layer looks like.
And you guys, we are hearing from the COO of CloneForce AI, who just so happened to be one of our sponsors. So a word from our sponsors. I would like
like to introduce you to our sponsors because without them, this podcast will not exist. So our first sponsor is Reed Smith. Reed Smith is a globally recognized law firm helping founders navigate every stage of growth from formation and fundraising to scale and exit. Our next sponsor is Sunstone. They support entrepreneurship, education, and inclusive innovation by partnering with universities, nonprofits like us, accelerators, and public-private initiatives to create opportunities for the next generation of founders. And last but not least, we have CloneForce.
Most companies today are still using AI as a point solution, writing copy, summarizing meetings, answering questions. That's useful, but it's still basically AI as a tool. What we're building at CloneForce is really the next layer beyond that. We're building clones, persistent AI teammates that can actually operate across the tools the company already uses. So instead of another chatbot sitting off to the side waiting for a prompt, you have a digital worker with identity, memory, voice, context, and the ability to take action in the flow of work. What's powerful is that these clones can be shaped around a specific role or person. They can have the right knowledge base, the right skill set, the right tone, and they can work across chat, email, Slack, meetings, CRM, and other business systems. So they're not just there to assist, they can actually help execute and strategize. And from a platform standpoint, we're model neutral, tool neutral, and channel neutral. So we're not forcing customers into one model or one interface. We're giving them a command center for their AI workforce with the flexibility to use the best tools for each job and the governance layer to manage it all responsibly. For businesses, this changes the equation pretty dramatically. It means that you can scale execution, consistency, and responsiveness without scaling overhead the traditional way. You're not just buying software, you're deploying digital labor in a much more practical, controlled, and effective way. At a high level, we think the future of work is human-centered and clone-powered. Humans should be focused on judgment, relationships, and creativity, and clones should take on more of the repeatable cross-system execution that eats up so much time today.
Great. Let's go ahead and let's move over to CloneForce then.
Okay.
So Scott, so you had early success after college. You guys had the acquisition. Then you had your billion-dollar acquisition from Google. How have you taken some of the lessons you learned from your previous companies and brought it into CloneForce? Yeah,
it's a great question. I think, when Chad and I talked about this extensively and really making sure there's product market fit up front with the technology. We were at Veritone. I felt like there was time to time where obviously from a customer experience perspective or customer success, I'm never going to leave our customers hanging, but you have to be careful in that. This is going to sound silly, but it's almost, you can get too good at your job in terms of managing the customer where you're masking, some enhancement needs to, the core software. So, meaning if my customer success people are coming in, plugging this hole to kind of remove that pain point from the end customer, then you're sometimes, changing development priorities, you're masking certain areas that can come back and haunt you down the road from time to time. And that's one that stands out a lot.
So you're in a very unique position in the world, if you will, going back more than 250 years to, the Industrial Revolution. We're going through something even bigger now. Yeah. And CloneForce is squarely in the middle of that. Take that with the fact that you've been involved with so many companies that you've started from zero and brought up to quite large. So one of the biggest issues in startups, in business in general, is that you're not going to be put out of business probably because of what customers do or don't do. You're probably put out of business by something you did internally.
Yep.
And that's why culture is so critical. But you're now building a company that is clone run to a certain extent, and that's your future, is clone run. So tell me how you build culture with a hybrid workforce.
Yeah, and I think, and that's why I really do believe in our products, because we're even taking that into consideration as it relates to agentic AI. And we have this conversation a lot internally because, I'll talk to some, AI strategists or, AI architects, and and I love having the conversations. They're like, who cares if it's a human? Like, why does it need to be a human? And I'm like, well, it 100% doesn't, other than, I don't go spend $2,000 to go rent a studio or get permits to go do basic shoots when I need to cut this or that. Like, we're all content creators to a large extent now in today's world. And so from that perspective, the personas that go into every single clone kind of matter a little bit. And then, and even with our new version of the software, we have org templates. And so administrators, product champions can add a little bit of company culture to every single clone that any of their users create. And having that cohesion, I think, is really, really important. The guardrails, the guardrails and sort of org admin that all of the administrators and product champions can do, it plays a large role in that. But I think you're exactly right that even, as we migrate towards agentic AI, managing more of your daily and dealing with the change management that goes into that, it's very savvy point that it's important to take that in consideration right now. And I think some groups are like, just Claude Code can do it, or Claude Cowork can do it. And, as those use cases, and now that we're going after the consumer side of things too, those use cases and, how families and how folks with disabilities kind of, manage their relationships with the clones, and making sure we have the skill sets and capabilities for them to do that is a really important piece of that puzzle.
So how much does the cloud of singularity hanging over your head and the responsibility there, do you guys have conversations about that?
A little bit. I mean, I hope we see more legislation passed now, sooner rather than later, to give everybody kind of a good look at, where we're going to draw the lines with certain things. I think, because we're in some regulated industries, we have to take compliance and because you can almost think of us as enterprise grade OpenClaw. There are a lot of similarities, but, in terms of OAuth connections and some of what we did for, governance, risk, and compliance, spills into, making sure that there's always those guardrails and for, the next few years, at the very least, human in the loop on a lot of those. We don't even pretend that, and I haven't seen a lot of true autonomous platforms out there that are just completely making their own decisions.
But it's coming, right?
It 100% is coming. And I think, having those system overrides, because at the end of the day, I think it is software, right? And
but how do you do a system override with a true agentic autonomous clone?
Yeah, I think, you have the system instructions. I mean, their core edict in terms of how they're going to behave stems from their knowledge bases, stems from those system instructions. I think always making sure that that's an admin functionality that the end users don't necessarily have access to. And that's where I think making sure those guardrails get pushed in.
So you're trying to bake it in, but we started this conversation with what movie you truly align yourself with. So now we're talking about iRobot, okay, where the prime directive is violated by an autonomous entity.
Right.
How do you stop that?
Yeah, I think it's not building the systems and using architecture that would give them the ability to run amok, right? And so, in terms of them, where I see some autonomous activity, occurring now is them having, because right now it can go run up your credit card bill real quick by just, token bloat and everything else. But in terms of, like in our system, user creates a connection, it has access into your inbox, right? And can view what emails you've received. But there is no concept of, without taking human input, there is no concept of, well, I wonder what emails I could go look through today.
It's all about permissions and permission-based. Yeah. All right, and that's your guardrails you're talking about.
Exactly.
So that each of us can be safe.
And that's on every layer. And that's something we really spent a lot of time in our new version of our software, where it has more scopes, policies, object level permissions than any other software I've ever seen. And a lot of that has to do with, we have learned to not wait to build that in, because when you're trying to fold all that in when you're flying the plane at 30,000, it's always going to be more difficult than kind of overbuilding what you probably need right this second. So it's much easier down the road. And again,
that brings some good points and leads me to my next question. So there's a lot of founders in our community that are looking to build right now, and they're using agentic AI. What's some advice that you would give for a founder who is creating a startup today in terms of focusing on agentic AI?
There's no way to answer that without it being a little self-serving, but I do work with, I was on some meetings this morning where, we're with the CTO and the CEO, we're with the, I forget the exact title, AI architect, AI straight AI czar, exactly. And they had that, he had spent some considerable time over the course of the past, 4 or 5 months, handcrafting a whole bunch of, specific, Claude cowork skills. And so he was kind of asking, well, why would I use this instead of this? And a lot of that had to do with, we sit as the execution layer for all your digital systems, not just, your AI models, but, so I think our thesis is, I certainly don't like having to go use 14 different UIs every single day if it's HubSpot and Salesforce, and we're at a point now where, barking orders to your clones, via SMS or Slack, has negated the need for me to be in a lot of these different systems. Even on the administration layer side of things, I'm able to kind of manage Google Workspace. Like, our new employee onboarding is 100% clone centric now. And, that allows it to be 100%, compliant in terms of, how we're managing things, how, the artifacts that need to be there for audits. And so we're using it to make life a little bit easier, not just on that one, get this deck done, but the artifacts you need for compliance. And so it has a little bit of a snowball effect in terms of how, how you're looking at the efficiencies across your entire organization at the end of the day.
So as far as the founders that are reaching out for support, investor funding, what is a pitch that is resonating with investors today? Yeah,
I think, and again, it's probably not too dissimilar over the course of the past, 10, 15 years where, the old days of the late 90s where, I mean, you didn't even really, like if your revenue line item part of the sheet was missing, like, I don't even know if it really mattered. Like, that's very different now. And it creates some unique, unique situations where, the VCs are really looking for the unicorns, the private equity groups of which we've had a lot of really neat conversations. That's really interesting to me because they already have kind of a portfolio of companies that they're looking to become, we have a tight fit with those type of groups because, we're, the main use case of clones a lot of times is efficiency gains, and, driving revenue. And so, they're able to kind of invest, implement the solution across their entire portfolio of companies. They have better visibility into kind of day-to-day operations. And so for, during safe rounds, Series A, that's really interesting to me. I think, the part as you get a little bit older, and we've been somewhat self-funded. We have a safe round, but, the beginning of our company, we're self-funded. And then, you have a path to profitability, even if you're just self-funded. Then it's harder. You have more decisions to make as a founder. Like, okay, do I really, you got every VC group in this under the sun telling me, okay, you got to go raise like 60, 80 million. And I'm like, well, why? Like, I don't want to turn this into a lifestyle business. And at the end of the day, this is one of those entities that we are going to more than likely, offload or sell at some point in the future. But, there's a lot to think about there. As it relates to how much equity do you want to let go? And we're going into consumer. And so once you start going into consumer, you do need the war chest of marketing spend. I was kidding around internally. I'm like, we have a DR business now. Like just, having been in digital media for, watching some of these neat little, somewhat simplistic DR companies. I'm like, I got jealous sometimes. I'm like, look how easy you just put in the ad budgets every month and out comes the revenue. Like, I'm like, why don't I ever start one of these where it's that easy? I mean, that's all there is to it.
So so now that you've been, and how long have you been, when did CloneForce start?
Just about a year ago. So,
and there's been acceleration of change over the past few months.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's changed in terms of your strategy, or how are you looking at the market, or what the moat is you're trying to protect over the past, I think, 6 months or so?
What the one big change, or I don't even want to say a pivot, because it was reprioritization, because we had a pretty good handle on kind of all the drivers, where things were going to go. The big the big needed push was the need for the product to be enhanced as fast as humanly possible on kind of two fronts. One is the visibility into the accuracy rates of these capabilities, right? And that is where we want the users to be comfortable, the administrators to be comfortable, that their teams aren't just spinning their wheels. So if it's something as simple as, go create me a deck on this, did the, drive operator work? Did the sheets operator work? Did the knowledge base lookups? And so the clones themselves are keeping logs of their accuracy rates that all users have visibility into. And that was a big piece, where giving the users that understanding of how accurate they're going to be on any requests that you have from them. That was one big piece. I think, the need to really try, to drive that distinction between what a ChatGPT can do on the chat side of things and what a clone that has the right knowledge base, knowledge structures, that understands, that's maybe fed every transcript of every meeting you're ever in. And so not only does it have like instant recall on what you're doing, but it really contextually understands my speaking style, like the entire corpus of everything. And so it's starting to redefine. And this is where, I just wish I had more time in the day, because it's really interesting to me as it relates to how we're redefining what expertise is, because I think that's an interesting one, who really is the experts now on any subject out there.
Yeah. And you, as Michael said, you're at the forefront, you're at the bleeding edge of what's happening with technology. What are you the most excited about? And now that you're looking into the edge, you're looking into the frontier, what are you the most excited about?
I'm going to answer this honestly, which is, I don't know if it ever is going to come just because of my personality, but the idea of having some more free personal time, I'm very excited about. I don't know if I'm going to actually take myself up on that, just because I love what I'm doing. And, it's, even at 51 years old, it's, 20-hour days. Most days, not a lot of sleep, but there's the necessity to build out the team, but also it's a very crowded, very competitive segment, obviously. But yeah, where I do see it every single day is you work with the clone to get this all geared up, and then it is fire and forget. Meaning, there are there's no one on my IT team right now besides the clones. And so all of those processes that eat up time in HRIT, in IT proper, you get those kind of fleshed out, and we're going to save millions and millions of dollars on the human capital side of things as well, because we built it the right way at the beginning. And so I think that's the other side of things, dovetailing off another one of your previous questions, that really making sure you do it, to a certain extent, I feel like you have to do it the right way the first time now, versus leaving scopes and permissions to phase 2 of it, because getting the time you need for phase 2 is never going to happen. So just bite the bullet, do it the right way right out of the gates.
So based on that, in terms of final words that you would give to an early stage founder.
Yeah, I feel like the basics they're going to know, it will be the hardest you're ever going to work. It will also be the most rewarding. I think I alluded it to a little bit, but in my humble opinion, everyone being on the same page, which sounds so simple, it really plays into ultimate success, right? Because I'm even seeing it with my friends or people I've worked with for 20 years, where you go through your day to day and you guys all think you're on the same page, but if it's not, even stuff like making sure you're watching the metric, I love data ops. I love, the metric side of the business, but they're always running and they're in my inbox. They're, the clones got it in this channel, the clones got it in this channel. But if you're not pushing in and really making sure, even if it's 2 minutes of every single meeting where everyone's looking at the same metrics at the same time every week, I think it's just those simple little disciplines that I think go a long way in really making sure, and some of that's just behavioral, where I'll I'll annoy people and like, say that again, say that a different way, where they almost think I'm pandering them. I'm like, no. Like, to me, I just really need to understand. Sometimes I'll do it because I'm like, I don't know if you know what you're talking about. Let me push a little bit here. But, by and large, normally I'm just doing it to really make sure I kind of understand what they're saying and what the approach is and what the follow-up action items are going to be. So a lot of it, like, every clone, every meeting we have, I'm looking for my clones to do two things: make sure we're nailed down on alignment, and then what are the action items, right? And that's where it gets scary in terms of growth too, where every day there's more stuff. Like I'm never going to be able to catch up on work because every single day there's more work getting created than is going off the list. But so it's almost like the phrase from before kind of still resonates. Make sure that everyone knows that we're going to Mammoth. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Any final questions for Scott?
Yeah, I would like to know what you would tell a student now, whether they should go to college or not go to college, and what should they learn in college, knowing the kind of world that CloneForce is going to help create.
And I have 3 college-age kids. So my daughter just graduated from NYU. My son's going to be a sophomore at Boulder, and my youngest is going to be a freshman at Chapman next year. And so we have this conversation all the time. And I mean, in the tongue-in-cheek response, I tell them there's only 2 outcomes. Like, you're going to be running the AI systems, or the AI systems are going to be running you. Like, and I really do think I mean that in all sincerity for what the future has to come. I think, one of my youngest is an artist. And so the way he thinks about AI is much different than my middle son, who's different than my oldest, who, has a dual degree in fashion and business. And, so on one hand, she's photography and art. On the other side, it's dollars and cents.
Right, but kids are terrified right now.
Yeah, I think
they're in a free fall. So what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think so. It's know the systems. You're going to utilize these tools no matter what type of jobs that you're doing. And my daughter, who's starting her first real full-time job in the next couple weeks, I make sure, and all 3 of them use CloneForce for to help study, to help prepare for classes. It's the same type of thing. So even I'm sure I'll go pitch my daughter's company at some point to become customers. But, right out of the gates, it's okay, make sure you can illustrate, that you're ahead of the curve as it relates to efficiency, because, I don't think it's all going to come down to we all get our little personal scorecard and how efficient were you on this, or this. But it's like those type of things are going to be so much easier where I'm like, okay, this, and we have that in customer support now, like how many tickets have you cleared and everything else. So I think that's at its core, like learn how the tools you're utilize, make sure you understand where to lean on them, for efficiency gains or to drive revenue and the like. I think, the way we position it is, you still need that human in the loop. We're augmenting a human-based workforce at the end of the day. We're not trying, because I think we're a ways off, and I don't know if it will ever be there. Just, we're there just running the show. I mean, this is a tool that the more creative you are, the more you understand kind of your business, your workflows, the more you're going to get out of a system like ours. And then just be prepared for that change management. Like, change isn't bad, it's just different. And I see that with just individual users where, it's not the technical ones. It runs the gamut. And some are just really excited. They push in and they really want to understand how to utilize this. And there's some people that are really standoffish. And it's really interesting to me where, it's almost like they freeze up. Like they don't know what to say to the clones. I'm like, here's just a one sheet. Like, just cut and paste any of this. Like, and then they'll do that first time they just paste something into a chat bot. And then it replies back, and then they're kind of engaged. Then it's like, I'm like, okay, so they're going to know a lot about you, so it's going to feel like you're talking to a.
So is it time for TCVN to get a clone for ourselves?
It is absolutely time.
It's time.
We're going to make that. We're going to make that happen.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely.
A lot of valuable insights, and I do have a question for you. If there were 2 people you would recommend that we have on our podcast, who would they be?
Ever? Or like,
no, is there anyone you would recommend that we invite to our podcast?
Just from our company or anyone in Orange County?
Yeah, anyone in Orange County.
Well, Chad's got to be one of them.
Okay.
He's in Orange County, and as the chairman of this entity. I'm trying to think. I worked really closely as the COO of Steinberg Sports.
Okay.
And if you guys having Leon would be interesting. He's tail end of his his working career, day-to-day working career at this point. But working with him and rebuilding his agency was really an interesting time because he's one of the more intelligent people I've ever met. But the concept of giving back and working that into every single element of his practice, what he did with the players, I think spreading that message, or really because there's one a lot of people will do it on the surface, but it was really at the core of everything we did with that business. So I think he would be another one that would be really interesting to
Sounds great.
to talk to. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Cool.
Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
My
Scott.
pleasure. Thank you guys.
Let me wrap it up because we need to still have
Yeah.
I'm going to do a call to action with
Perfect.
you, okay? So thank you so much for your time with us. So if our listeners are trying to look for you guys, where can they find you?
Yeah. So clone.me is one of the primary domains, cloneforce.com. Those both end up the same place. And then, we're on LinkedIn. We got all the socials going. Clones are busy bees, helping us manage our social footprint. Otherwise, support at cloneforce.com is an email that, Graham's one of our clones that's watching that along with our customer success team. So yeah, always happy to have a conversation with everybody.
So we're going to have everything in the show notes. And if you find value in this podcast, please go ahead and share it with a friend, subscribe to our channels, and we look forward to see you in our next podcast. Bye, guys.